All right. Well, good morning, Nick.
Good morning, Matt. Good to see you.
Good to see you. All right. This morning, for our Vogue Academy talk, we are going to kind of continue our discussion about how we interact with our lived world, and we're trying to give a very practical example. And we, before our talk last week, and actually before this talk, we were discussing presentations, like, when you actually have to stand before people and give a presentation. And as we all know, that can be incredibly intimidating and frightening for folks. So we just thought, okay, what angle can we bring to this that can be illuminating and hopefully helpful to folks? So Nick, I don't know if you want to kick us off with that example from your book that we were talking about.
Yeah, I'm gonna throw you a curveball, Matt. So I'm gonna tell you a personal anecdote to ground this. If that's okay. So
yeah, please.
Okay, so I'm in high school. I'm a typical adolescent, very self-conscious, maybe more self-conscious than many. Senior year, track banquet. I got an award, walked up there, got it. But we were also given an award to my event coach, Mr. Gunther, cool guy. Well, I was the senior captain of the team. I had to give the speech and give it to him. Not pleasant. I get up there, I got my little tie on. This is in the 80s. So I got my thin tie on. And I go up to the microphone. Can't remember where this place was. And I open my mouth to speak, and like literally a squeak comes out. Because I'm so anxious and stressed. My throat's like a squeak comes out. That's how scared I was of public speaking. Right? I could not make recognizable sounds. Now, interesting, I hadn't thought about it till literally right now. Well, the squeak gave me an opportunity to make a joke, right? I made some joke, and then that kind of made me relax, and then I was able to get through it, which I think is kind of interesting. It kind of broke the frame, right? Rather than how am I going to look? Am I going to entertain these people? Am I going to sound smart? I have to do it right. I'm public speaking in front of these people, these eyes. I think that was going on. I know that was going on. It still goes on. But somehow that broke the frame, right? That I had a moment of improvisation that felt a little more comfortable, maybe, in the moment to say something. So, I think one of the things we want to ground this is in what does it feel like to be giving these presentations, which is a little bit different, but related to how do you do it well?
Right.
And so I feel like self-consciousness is something that's part of me that's related, but not the same as self-awareness, which we want to bring to the fore here. And there's this substrata of giving a good, effective presentation and presenting oneself. So that's kind of, in my mind, it was a seminal moment. Also, what the effect of that was, then every other subsequent public speaking, I was scared I was going to do it again. Right? That nothing was going to come out. I didn't think, oh, I handled that. I can, if something comes up, I can make it. I did not think that at all. I'm like, oh, you got up there and talked and nothing came out. That's going to happen again. And so that was just actually added to my anxiety and stress. So I'd literally be shaking. I learned to get instead of having a piece of paper, because if you have a piece of paper and you're shaking, people can see it and hear it. So I'd always speak with a clipboard because it doesn't shake. You can't hear it. So I put the paper on that, and then I'd hold that literally. An event, just to say, though I teach for a living and sometimes do public speaking and do these things, it's from 30 years of practice, and 20 of them or more were not very pleasant, to be honest with you. In any event, so that's one angle on this today. We may harken back to that or not, but to harken back to last week, I gave this example that comes from our book, Life Beyond Grades, reading about a very thoughtful teacher. I think it was Marilyn Weimer, who's really important in higher ed teaching and learning, but I'm not 100% sure. I can't recall off the top of my head. But the story goes, she's a renowned scholar, I think an endowed chair at Duke. So that means really high performing in her field. And of course, she's teaching. And she said she's writing this, it's not a memoir exactly, but she uses this anecdote to introduce something about teaching to faculty. She's speaking to faculty, and she says, I realized after 25 years, what I was doing in the classroom was not really oriented toward the students. It was oriented toward me looking smart. What I was trying to do was look smart. Then I think she had the awareness that a lot of us are trying to do that. And then the implications of what are all the moment-to-moment thoughts and decisions and choices we make to look smart rather than to evoke learning or engagement or to promote that. Right? And if a high-powered Duke professor with accolades from the highest institution is trying to look smart in front of some 18 and 19-year-olds, we can imagine the effect on those 19-year-olds, right? I remember being on the other end of that, like, whoa, my first philosophy professor, like, what are you talking about? Just over my head. And he was sort of talking to the grad student in the room, but everybody else was just blown away. And it was, I'm not blaming him, it's just kind of off-putting. So the point I think from our lens is we can be unaware for a long time of what's truly motivating us, or at least we be unaware of all of our motivations. I think she wanted her students to learn. It wasn't that, but she didn't realize how much of her action was motivated by this desire to appear smart and then get that affirmation, which is back to last week's topic. And then she goes on to say, when she was able to gain that awareness, have a different intention in the moment, coupled with techniques and methods and strategies for teaching that change her actions, the interactions, and therefore the results and impact and engagement of the students. That's why it's so powerful, right? That gaining awareness is the basis for changing the nature of that interaction and the results.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think that story highlights the fact that, she had to manage her needs for the accolades, or if I'm concerned about being smart, you have to realize that informed all those little tiny decisions and choices she made for what to say, what not to say, how to, and then if that's the case, that is versus having an attitude like, how best do I teach students here, where your self-worth isn't on the line or as stake as much. So that's the drive at, is like this, when you are unaware, and not when you are unaware, but also really focused on managing your lived world for your personal needs, that is informing all your decisions. I think that, it's so easy to not see how important that point is, if that makes sense. Like, because it's like, oh yeah, okay, whatever. But it's like, no, this really has impact. This has consequences that inform and shape how you are as a teacher, how you are as a professional in the workplace, and how you are as a parent, given our talk from 2 weeks ago. Yeah, I mean, these it's so important to become aware of what really is in your heart and being expressed. We talked about that Latin, that what's pressing out into your actions and thoughts. And then, and then becoming aware of your motivations, and then to make some hard choices. Like, it's hard because, when to be willing to give up, or at least jeopardize, let's say, what you perceive to be your perception amongst peers or students, or even, let's say, you're giving a presentation to the board of trustees, or your superiors in your company. That's really hard. I mean, so we understand the stakes are high at times, but to be an effective presenter, teacher, professional, you need to be self-aware and understand what's really motivating you. So that's point number one.
Yeah. I think then a lot of things follow from that. If you're able to do that, then, because public speaking is so fraught for me, I've looked to advice and other people. The Dalai Lama gave me some advice. The Dalai Lama, in his book, The Art of Happiness, says, someone asked him, are you nervous when you get, and he says, yeah. And they said, well, how did you, like what? How do you handle that? And he says, well, basically it says, I stopped thinking about me and how I appear and really tried to focus on the audience and being helpful to them.
Mm.
And so it's really getting outside of yourself and this need for myself and saying, well, why am I here? How can I interact with them? And what I found is, because I have taught people public speaking, and is if you're thinking about the checklist of things you're supposed to do, then you're focused on you.
Right.
If you're thinking about, are they getting it? Are they going to take away something of value? Am I right? That I'm sensitive to them, that I'm responsive to them, right? The interaction, the energy, and the attention is like me to them versus me within my head. I know that when I'm doing that, I'm not as effective. If I'm responsive and notice, and then and also that intention of being effective communicator is different than looking smart.
Right. I also think when you become self-aware, and it's interesting, isn't it? Once you become self-aware, then you actually become more aware of the people in the room. I think that's such a fascinating point, right? Because when you're not self-aware, you're projecting a certain way of being or whatever onto the other. So, I mean, we see this, I saw this all the time when I was, leading a creative agency. People just naturally assume that everyone is just as excited and interested in your topic as you are, which is not the case. And so for marketing, part of the reason is, well, how do I generate interest and really help you, energize and activate your respective audiences? And where people are just like, well, yeah, I'm so excited about this. Of course, people are going to be excited about it. We're like, no, because
Obviously, yeah.
obviously. And we're like, no, because they've got 1,000 other concerns and they're more concerned about their own, lives and, companies and whatever. So you're trying to somehow grab a little bit of their attention when they're, really want to be focused on other things. So that's the challenge of marketing. So that's one concern, is to, help people become more self-aware. Another thing we were talking about is, especially for people who are teaching, and when you have a checklist and you're just trying to communicate information, it's so easy to think that, the expression tabula rasa, they're these blank slates, and they're just these open, pure receptacles of your information.
Right.
And then you're just like blown away that they didn't get what you were saying. Like, I remember
all they have to do is just take in what I say and everything will be great, and they're not doing it.
Yeah, right. It's so crystal clear. Yeah. So they're the problem, not you. I mean, I remember I mean, when I was in Princeton Seminary, and you do these field educations, and I had to preach, and I didn't really like preaching, and I was fascinated by how little people got. Like, I had my 3 million points, and then you talk to people afterwards and they didn't get it at all. I mean, I'm literally like, what's your problem? And I'm like, I think meanwhile I realized, like, I'm the problem, not them.
Right.
I mean, I'm the problem in the sense that I wasn't sensitized to the fact that people are coming with their own agendas, their own
lenses,
and lenses, whatever. And they're filtering all your information through their own matrix of expectations, needs, and preoccupations and whatnot. So you just don't realize that, because you're so focused on yourself, and I got to communicate this, and then and again, it's your own need. Like, you see this with people are really impassioned, and, I'm not saying, like, for social justice or this concern or whatever, it's all great, but then you get frustrated when people aren't getting it, and as much as you are, and then you don't realize that that's your problem, not really their problem, because you're not communicating it well. Again, we'll get more into this, but just the fact that we tend to so easily project the issue onto others. Kierkegaard called this an acoustic illusion. That was a great term. Like, somehow, like, instead of saying, well, why am I so frustrated with people when they don't get it? Or what is it? What could I do better to help communicate? We're like, well, obviously they're the problem,
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's that, it points to that need to manipulate and manage your live world for your own personal needs.
Mm-hmm. Well, I like, the psychologist in me who's interested in mechanisms and processes, that level of, so what does it mean to be self-aware? What are we doing when we're not self-aware? So we got, I think, some useful terms. Preoccupation, which was one of my term I think is just so descriptive. Before the situation I'm in, I'm already occupied. My
Right.
mind is elsewhere. It's occupied by something else that may not have anything to do with what you're doing, and then that preoccupation, the occupation of my mind, creates a lens and expectations and interpretations through which I then project and impute. And so I think it's useful for me, it's always just to name what's going on. What do you mean, number one? So what is self-awareness? Well, first, one level is I'm aware of that I'm projecting. I'm aware that I'm preoccupied. I'm aware that my lens shapes my interpretations to the extent that at least two, and I know more great thinkers, the Buddha and Kierkegaard, said, you're creating an illusion. You're delusional. This thing you're making is an illusion. And so how is it an illusion? How do we do that? What are we doing? I'm in a different situation than the other person thinks they're in, right? I think these things are evident and they don't. So I think for me, it's those preoccupation, projection, kind of, and then below that is another kind of set of self processes, self-protection, self-promotion, reaching out and trying to get them to think about me in a particular way. So I think those are different strata, if that makes sense, of self processes, but of course deeply related, and I think rarely are either focused on, but especially what you were saying about, well, the reason we create an illusion, or the motivation that leads to us to creating illusions, is to try to create a situation in which we feel okay about ourselves, where we think other people will feel good about, will affirm us, or in other ways give us approval. And I think, you're right to say people are not aware. They're not aware that that's what's motivating them, and that was the example that we started with. They're also not aware of then this, how moment to moment that affects them, that they see a certain look in someone's eye at the table, and then that affects them, which is understandable. As human beings, we're incredibly sensitive to that. But I think that's one of the examples of how it's not just, oh, I came into the speech my senior year being fearful. It's I stood up there and I saw the microphone and I looked out and I had an expectation and I saw somebody and I'm supposed to do this and I don't really know how to do that. And what if the smirk of my co-captain over there, like, you got to go up there and all these things. And that's all powerfully shaped by, I'm supposed to perform. So I think another thing I learned was from who actually was a student of mine, who then became a protege, said, I try to go into every presentation to learn something. What can I learn? And it just really shifts the relationship. If I go in, for me, if I feel like I have to be the authority and know everything, I feel okay about that. If I feel like I have to entertain people and tell a joke, I'm really nervous. I don't like that. That's not my style. But if I can go in there to say, how do I learn from doing this presentation? What could I learn? I actually approach the presentation differently. I incorporate questions. There's time for people so I'm not just yammering on like I am right now, blah, 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 but it actually changes the very structure and format of the session. Then I can be responsive to them. Then I have to sit up there and think a little bit. Now I'm out of my head. I'm focusing on that. Like, what did they say? So I think that's been a really powerful shift. It's not related to self-awareness precisely, but it is a process. Like, I'm here to learn something versus.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, that's good.
Okay. It made me think about our procrastination course, and some of the strategies you give are not necessarily like self-awareness, although we think that's first and foremost, but it's how do I reduce what's at stake, or
The expectations. Yeah.
yeah, the expectations. How do I? And so coming in with the idea, well, what can I learn? It instantly makes the situation less frightful, and less kind of a life or death situation. So that stress reduction is awesome. But I wanted to ask you a question. Uh, so I think one thing we're saying, we got to be self-aware, and then we see one of the key realizations that we have to come to is to see our over dependence upon the lived world for our self-worth, like that we're looking for the accolades, looking for ways that from things that are contingent, temporal, fragile, to give us this constant need that we have for affirmation and meaning and purpose. So we know, and that creates anxiety because we know that these things, they come and go, and so we know that it's a constant management that's demanded of us to get this back. So there's this dependence, and then someone says, okay, I see that it's adversely affecting me, but it's also adversely affecting my performance, or my productivity, my activity, and adversely affecting those I care about. But then the next question is, well, what do I do? Like, it's one thing to realize that, but then it's like, how do you let go in a really positive, constructive way that allows you to be more effective and more loving and caring and whatnot towards those around you, in a way where you're not dependent on consequences as much? I know that's kind of a tough question to answer, but
yeah. I have a couple thoughts, and I can turn to, I think my understanding of Buddhism is a big thread of that is to figure out how to do it. It's very practical. The Buddha was a healer, not a divine entity. He's like, how do you deal with suffering? And part of the suffering is coming from exactly what you're talking about. You're emphasizing other people's that social interaction or your needs. I think a couple things. One is you need a power. This is a powerful, pervasive drive, need, right? That we have. It's part of being a human being. At least, and maybe more so in our contemporary society more than ever, where we have the possibility to be affirmed by literally thousands, if not millions of people. And a bunch of other people are getting affirmed with likes and thumbs up. And so I think I think we should recognize that that's probably pretty fundamental, and in a very individualistic society like ours, it's really basic. So I think most people without some sort of training, awareness, development of skills are going to experience this. And it is the default. It's the norm. So what I would say is the first thing is there's a reason that's the norm. It's like procrastination. There's a reason people do it. There's a lot of reasons, in fact. So if you want to change, if you want to go against the grain, go against the stream, you're going to need some powerful motivation. So when you said for the purposes of, like, why do I want to not be so responsive? What is the purpose of that? What's driving me? So I need to have that powerful motivations and reasons, and I also need to keep them in my mind in various ways, so they're affecting my choices. So at one level, and that maybe doesn't sound very practical in strategy, but I think it is, which is, why do you want to change? And part of that is, what happens if you don't change? What are the costs? And I'm always a little fearful of talking about the negatives and fears motivation, but it is a net motivation, and it is powerful. So we need to account for that. Humans are motivated by loss aversion. That what are you going to lose? What are you not going to get? I think that gives us energy. I think it doesn't give us necessarily direction. So what do you want? How do you want to feel? What do you want your relationships to be like? What do you want your life to be like? And then have that as a vision, to write it down, to keep track of it, to find ways to put it in your mind, to see examples that people you want to emulate. I think these are practical strategies. And then another, is some of the strategies are moment to moment. So I gain awareness. Can I be aware that I have this impulse, but accept it? So that if I don't accept it, if I judge it, then I am very likely to be anxious or angry with myself or resentful. And now I'm in a state an emotional state that makes it hard to make choices, to change behavior, right? If you're in a state of stress, it's hard to change your patterns. In fact, you're more likely to evoke your patterns. So awareness, a kind of acceptance, not acceptance like, oh, this is fate, inevitable, but acceptance is this is the way it is. I have these tendencies. I have this pattern. I behave this way. It's understandable. I don't like it, but I want it to be different. And then there's a whole slate of toolbox of techniques and methods of various kinds, I think, too, for emotional regulation, for reframing, for self-talk, creating environments, creating communities that support us in making these changes and differences. So I think, without getting into some of the specifics, we can get into some of the specifics, but I think that's the kind of general framework that I would bring is you want to change your action. Actions are related to deeply rooted in motivation, but they're also a feature of them is how you're feeling and how you construe the situation that you're in. So the environment and your relations to other people. So that's my first thought. Is that getting to your answer? How does that respond? How do you respond to that?
Oh, I didn't like, okay, well, I have my answer, but I didn't necessarily, I just curious. I just think if I was listening or watching this talk, that would be a question I would have is like, yeah, okay, but these are still powerful forces I'm dealing with. And it's, I don't want to create a vacuum where I'm trying to deny myself something I've been dependent on for years and years and years. And now I'm trying to change myself. I would be at a loss at where to go. So I think you're right. There are certain strategies that no matter where you're coming from and even what your kind of core beliefs and, spiritual religious beliefs are, there are certain practices that are, I can't say common, but they transcend particular beliefs. And that's why, it's so fascinating for me to talk with you, given, here I come from, as people know, from a Kierkegaard contemplative Christian perspective. And yet when we talk, you're always like, oh, Buddha, there's so much similarities in terms of the practices. I mean, at the end, we obviously diverge. But there at that point of divergence is where my ultimate answer is I feel like Kierkegaard would always talk about, he would always emphasize this one quote from Jesus from, I don't know if you know the story of Mary and Martha that were from your Catholic upbringing.
I've heard it. Do I remember? It's another matter. I think
well, anyway,
Jesus
goes to his house. There's these two sisters and their brother, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And he goes to the house and, so Martha is running around, trying to, make sure everyone's got a seat and the food and whatever. And she's running, and then Mary, her sister's just sitting at Jesus's feet. And Martha gets kind of pissed off, and and exasperated. And at one point she goes to Jesus, can't you tell my, sister Mary to help me out here? It sounds like she says it publicly as if to say, hey, this,
I'm doing all the work here.
In a culture that really emphasizes hospitality, Mary is really blowing it, and I'm the one doing it. And it's, but you can see, right, it's such a great moment. And this is what I love, it's such a human moment, right? Because Martha is obviously frustrated. And instead of just kind of like going off to Mary, whispering her, hey, I could use some help, she very publicly, makes, lets everyone know what's going on. And Jesus says to her, I'm paraphrasing, Martha, Martha, you're concerned or distracted or preoccupied with many things, right? But Mary has chosen the better. She's chosen the one thing needful. But basically he said, and the way Kierkegaard and a lot of contemplatives take that is, okay, I mean, that was actually the story of Mary and Martha becomes this rubric for determining what's called the active life versus the passive life. And the passive life is this idea of contemplation. And I think that the distinction is wrong, honestly, but or it's not helpful, and it's actually led to a lot of distortions, and I think in the Christian life, but that's, for another time. But the point is that, what's really needful is really being in the presence of God, or the feet of Jesus. And so, and that's my answer, is that, we talked about being in the presence of God, and really, actually as radical as it sounds, there's this possibility of actually enjoying the presence of God always. And so if that's the case, and if you can never lose that, then ideally you're not as concerned. You can let go of these other concerns, because like I have the most important thing to me, which is the presence of God. So I'm freed up from having to be so concerned about how people perceive me, or will I get that job promotion, or will I get that internship, or the grade, and or peer perception, whatever. So that's ultimately my answer. That said, if you're not there, then there's still all these other practices and strategies that we've talked about that can really help, as we said, kind of reduce the stress levels, so you're not as enslaved to these ways you've kind of learned and
you've been conditioned and socialized and internalized and habituated. Well, I think one thing. Oh, go ahead.
No, please.
Well, I was going to say, we might. One way to think about it is, what are the psychological processes or mechanisms here? And so one thing word we haven't used is, so self-awareness, and then acceptance. There's an element of this is, where's our attention, right? And so in the parable, or the story is, so Mary's attention is fully on the thing that's most needful, the most important thing, right? And Martha's attention is diffuse. So this is very, if you think about it through the lens of attention, right? I'm not saying that's the whole story.
No, but it's a great perspective on the whole story.
Yeah. So from a Buddhist perspective, attention is like the starting point. So if you have that lens and you look at the situation, you say, where are people's attention? So my experience coaching and teaching is, and my own experience is, where I put my attention, my energy follows. And there's people that say, tell me where your attention is, I'll tell you what your life is like. Attention is pretty fundamental. So, and now there's an interesting thing about attention that we haven't talked about. So sometimes it sounds a little magical. Well, think about this, and then you won't worry about that. But there is a way that it's because Martha doesn't have to say, or the speaker doesn't have to say, oh, I don't want to be preoccupied with myself. Okay, don't be preoccupied with myself. Don't think about the elephant in the room, right? Well, that actually you're occupying your mind still with yourself. So one of the things about attention is, if you fill it with one thing, then you can't fill it with the other thing. You don't actually have to try to make this go away. It just goes away because of the nature of human attention. So if you can be fully present, if you can put all your attention, prioritize all your attention, as well as your motive and desire, then a lot of those things go away. And so if you're not thinking about how people perceive you, then you're often not anxious. You don't have to say, I don't want to be anxious. Don't be anxious. Don't be anxious. You can say, am I being effective? How could I be effective? What can I learn today? I'm just going to explain this as best I can. That could be the focus. So one of the things I always told students when I was coaching them on presentations, I'd always ask them, how many presentations do you remember? A single point. How many presentation, how many do you remember a single point? And they're like, 5% maybe? I'm like, so if you can convey 1 point, you've exceeded 95% of the presentations.
Right.
Does that seem doable? How would you do that? How would you get the 1 point across? And they're like, so I think then your attention is, how do I get my 1 point across? Which is very different than, is this the best presentation ever? Or how am I going to feel it? And so that's a very practical thing. But I think at root of that is attention. Where is my attention? And then my attention, that invokes my cognitive apparatus. What am I thinking about? Because that's where my attention is. Then what am I feeling? What beliefs or assumptions does that evoke? Does that bring to the table. And so I think this is how intrinsic motivation operates at an attentional level. I should read this. I've never read about this actually, but so I'm conjecturing, just to be clear, that because we're fascinated with that fascination fills up our attention. It takes all the attention and goes zoom, it focuses it, and therefore a bunch of other stuff simply recedes. And one thing I can say, there is a principle in psychology that's related to attention, which is replacement. So this is not, you don't want to remove something that usually leaves a vacuum or a gap or a sense of denial, that often you want to replace. That there's a principle, a behavioral change principle of replacement. So you don't just say, I'm not going to think this way, or I'm not going to talk to myself in this way. You say, what's another way to talk to myself that's more helpful, accurate, true, right? So, and that's a fundamental principle. So that's related to attention, I think.
You know, I can't say I had a complete aha here, but I wouldn't. When you were talking about attention in that way, it made me think about intrinsic motivation. What's interesting about intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic, when extrinsic motivations, I think, are inherent. I could be. This is me. We're on our conjecture streak. So
yeah, there you
go. Extrinsic is always this calculus about trying to get something from the external lived world, so that there's more of yourself at stake, I would say, from extrinsic motivations. And again, we're not saying I don't want to put that in a negative. Well, it's going to come across negative, but there we go. But it's somehow self-involving in terms of what I get out of this. Whereas intrinsic motivation, what's really interesting is yourself is less at stake.
Absolutely.
So because you're so absorbed, you don't have this self-protective, because you're just it made me think of Michael Polanyi and his term of indwelling, which we talked about, where you really are, like, it is at a tacit level, but when you kind of like enter into this space where you're just so focused with your attention on the material, you kind of go through that self-protective layer. You let that go. And what's interesting is that Michael Polanyi, and also I think I've mentioned this before, Iris Murdoch, I don't know if you know, she was a philosopher, famous writer, she was very influenced by another philosopher named Simone Weil, but Iris Murdoch's had a really big influence on philosophers today. But anyway, both of them were really fascinated with mystics, and not necessarily Christian mystics, just mystics in general, although they were both staunch atheists, because they felt like mystics somehow were able to get through that self-protective layer and just kind of they had an openness that that most of us don't have. And so I think a lot of that is that intrinsic motive, like that kind of dying to yourself kind of thing, where you kind of, you let go of that ego, that self, and you're just present in a way that you wouldn't be otherwise, because you're not worried about the consequences, and you're just fascinated by the subject matter and engrossed by it. And so anyway, that's kind of a meditative kind of state in a way.
Yeah, well, there's a few points of contact there. So I think engagement, absorption is a word I really like. So on the one hand, we are absorbed in the task, but and we often say, I lost myself in the task, right? So these everyday phrase, I always like that. I was lost in my work. You're lost. Your sense of self was lost. It receded. And you could say, on the one hand, immersed or absorbed. You were absorbed. Or you could say, and this is this kind of mystical piece where the sense of self dissipates, that the situation or the task absorbed you. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's you. And so that's kind of the from Caddyshack, Bill Murray, or the art of archery, like that, the situation, that task activity, and there's not separation. And so Buddhism, and before that Hinduism, and people, they've talked about this kind of universal consciousness or universal sense, that the world absorbs you, if you will, or the task absorbs you, is another way to think about it. And if the task absorbs you, if you're the drop of water that goes into the ocean and absorbs you, then your boundaries go away, right? And so many people have had these kinds of experiences where their sense of self goes away and they feel like they're part of something. I certainly have them. Usually, for me, it's in nature. I think for people, it's in music or art. There's something about this sense of self that goes away. And I think in part because it's a sense, right? Again, I like to use these terms, sense of self. It's not exactly that your self goes away. I don't know. There's lots of debate in Buddhism about that, but your sense of yourself goes away or diminishes, or certainly diminishes relative to where your attention is otherwise, which also suggests, and then that sounds like flow, something like that. Right?
Yeah.
That's a common everyday word. It's a kind of mystical experience. I've heard the word transcendence. All those things work for me at a psychological level. We have this, so that's available to us. So I think one thing that I haven't heard so much that I think Kierkegaard and your perspective reveals is, well, what does that say about all the other times? Right? Like if losing myself in this is so poignant, is so significant, so transforms my experience of that, what does it say about all the other times, all the other 23 hours, 59 minutes, and 58 seconds? What?
Right.
And I think that's to your point, which is it's always there, right? We're always acting. I think.
Yeah, no, I think, and this is, bring in Loader, person I've mentioned, my mentor before, and he said, in the normal ego development, and his interpretation is right away when the ego is forming, it's always me versus the world. And the world, and you want that separation, that sense of self, because it's kind of your way of asserting yourself over against this world that is kind of a threat. And that's why we manage and manipulate it and try to control it, and that need for control, because we kind of deep down kind of know that the world is bigger than us, indifferent to us, whatever. So we're trying to manipulate it and control it so that it gives us what we need or think we need. And when you can let go of that, and it doesn't have to be me versus the world, and that world I control, but then the stakes, like, there's less at stake at every moment,
Right.
because of that. And so I don't have to worry about, my spouse needs to be this way towards me, and my job needs to be this, and people need to see me this way. All these things that we are always occupied with, even when we're unaware of it, because we're just so used to being in that rut.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's, what makes it's a good first step is to realize that, because that already, just the awareness of that already reduces the stress,
Right.
of the management of that lived world. Yeah. So.
Well, you're bringing up a point. So I think it's a bit of a paradox for me, but and connected to Buddhism. So in Zen, as I understand it, and Tibetan Buddhism, the point isn't that you're becoming something. Well, that's not the right word. It's not that you're changing yourself into something. It's that you're letting go of things you don't need to hold on to.
Right.
And that allows you to express, to use your word, your capacities of clarity, of kindness, of wisdom, of equanimity, serenity, right? Those capacities are there. And a lot of times these are hindrances or obstacles that we have been conditioned and created, right? In part by wanting, to distinguish between myself and the world, and then trying to manipulate that world in some way. And so, and I think it's important, my understanding is important in Buddhism, because it's not like you're trying to do something or be something you're not. You're actually trying to be something you are. And so, okay, letting go, and that's a term you definitely hear a lot in Buddhist discourse, right? Let it go, let it go, let go. So I like that that's a strategy, that's a thing. And that's a different way of thinking than a lot of, and which I have a hard time with, frankly. I think I'm more like cultivate, like, no, I need to cultivate these things and do that and improve and right? And that can be at odds with letting go. So I think I'm still in. I don't quite know how to process that at a deep level. Like intellectually, I can see how that works, but I think I have a deeply internalized need to change myself, right? And so it kind of goes back and forth sometimes. Like, oh yeah, right, I understand that. And maybe this is what people who might be listening to us right now is, this is beautiful metaphor in some strains of Buddhism. This is the adamantine. There's a diamond in there. It's maybe covered in mud, right? So the mud, the lotus also, there's a beautiful lotus, but part of it's in the mud. It's not about being something different, right? It's about being what you are, but in getting rid of these things. And so some of these things are the social and psychological needs that you're talking about, to manipulate the world or seek affirmation, to attain certain kinds of things, which we, in some sense, part of us believes or has to internalize. That's going to bring me security or safety or these feelings of belonging, or if I attain, then I will be accepted. And if I'm accepted, then I can be secure and feel good. And that is not actually how human beings work. So let me see. No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, you made me think of, what are some practical tests to see where you're at on this? And I think a one that hopefully is relatable is that when you've been wronged, how great is the need to somehow that is acknowledged publicly? Because that's what Martha's doing, right? In that story of Mary and Martha,
Right.
She feels wrong, and she feels the need for that to be publicly acknowledged and addressed. What can but I think a sign of like a healthy self-awareness is not to say it might be good to talk with someone and resolve it, but the need to publicly have it to be addressed, can you let that go?
Right.
Or is it like it eats at you so much that you've been wronged, or even more, what if you've been falsely accused of something? I mean, can you live with that with peace and be like, it's all right, I mean,
That's
yeah,
them.
yeah, it might, yeah, Sam, yeah, boy, that would drive most of us crazy. And actually, Kierkegaard talked about this because there's this whole thing about his fiancee Regina Olsen, and what I won't get into it, but basically, he kind of like, can you be in such a way which everyone misinterprets your motivations, and you're okay with that, or do you kind of need for them to see what you're doing or that you've been wronged? He said most of us at some point we just can't break away from the crowd. And so that's the test anyway.
Well, let's go back to the original example, not mine, but of the teacher, the professor. Would you be willing to be thought of as less smart, but a more effective teacher? Right? The students learn more, but they don't think you're as smart as the other group did. Are you willing to do that trade-off? And I think, just to make it a little, I mean, I remember I had a moment, you talk about kind of being thrown back on yourself. This is a moment, and I look back on this sometimes. I have a tendency to be a smarty pants. I think for 30 years I was trying to be a smarty pants. I'm trying to get past that. But I remember I was in this training with this group, and then when I became a teacher, and then, we stayed in touch, and maybe a year later, one of the guys that was in my training group said, "Yeah, I thought you were a real know-it-all." Just kind of as a side, and you're not a jerk. You're kind of, and I'm like, and it so struck me because he kind of threw it off, and I'm like, oh yeah, I was totally trying to be a know-it-all. You're totally right. That's what I was thinking. Like, oh yeah, oh, that's how it gets perceived. I liked him. He's a good guy. Now it really I mean, this is literally over 35 years ago. Still remember this. And so I realized how much of my actions, I think it's still right, how much of my actions are being motivated to appear smart, to look smart. And it's really, in academia, I mean, it's very close to what you're trying to do. you're trying to create knowledge and be helpful and convey it and teach it, which isn't quite the same as looking smart, but it's pretty darn similar. And it can actually, that can motivate you to do the other thing. But often then if you don't get recognized, right, or your ideas are misinterpreted, then you could be really annoyed and angered versus, right, I think if you were trying to create knowledge and convey, you say, oh, I didn't convey that very well. How am I gonna do that better?
Right.
Yeah.
You made me think of a real obvious litmus test there is
Right.
your willingness to admit you don't know something.
Mm.
As a professor, a teacher, or even in the workplace. Here I led this creative agency. I'm supposed to kind of be a know-it-all, and there's times I'm like, I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
the ability to say I don't know takes a lot of courage, because again, it's an admission that you're not a smarty pants or not a know-it-all, and that puts your perception at risk.
Right,
So
from the self-worth theory, the perception of your competence.
yeah,
Right, and that's what's at stake here.
yeah,
And so if you equate competence with worth, and then that you think, and your conception of competence is everything, then you can see why that would be protective. So on this theme of litmus test, I think I have one that's a little bit adjacent, but I have found to be quite useful for people. So one way to understand if you're a litmus test to ascertain whether you're being motivated by approach motives, which would include intrinsic motivation, serving others, growth, development, fascination, things like that, versus avoidance motivation, fear, anxiety, stress, self-protection, defense, is to reflect on when you've actually turned in the paper or the project or the presentation that maybe created a lot of energy. And if you attained the objective goal, how do you feel about it? So if you think I'm trying to get an A, and then you get an A, do you feel I got an A, I'm triumphant? If you don't feel that, or not very much of it, that suggests to me that that wasn't your motivation. Your motivation wasn't to attain. Your motivation was to avoid
right,
failing.
yeah,
Right. And and what's the corresponding sensation and emotion to avoiding failure? Relief. So if you feel relief, so you get an A, but you feel relief, not triumphant. I think this is a litmus that tells us something about what was motivating us. And it's not usually so cut and dried, but having asked many people this, they can say the prevailing feeling was a relief. And this is not a judgment, again, so it's not a moral judgment.
right,
That's not the point. You should be motivated by approach motives. No, the point is that can explain why you burn out. You achieve, yet you're burnt out because you don't feel a sense of triumph. You're not getting energy back because fear, being driven by fear and then not having fear is not energizing. It's just not having fear.
right.
Whereas a sense of accomplishment, of improvement, that can often fuel us for the next thing. So we can gain awareness. Wow. And this is really common at Princeton, I think. A lot of, they're just on to the next thing. Oh, I escaped looking dumb. Now on the next thing to not fail.
Right.
And I've been there myself. It's not a moral judgment, nor is it funny exactly. But and so I think that is a litmus, and then gain awareness. And then okay, so with the test, what's the antidote to that, or how do I shift? And that kind of brings us back to your question: what is the things that we do? But I think sometimes that's a way to gain awareness without waiting 25 years, right? To say, what's motivating me?
Right. Well, I'm kind of want to shift the discussion a little bit to, let's say, you're at a point where you are more self-aware, and you're at a point where you're not as bound by your own needs, and you're starting to think about, well, how do I do a better lecture, and how do I do a better presentation in front of my colleagues or superiors at work? What would you say there? Like, obviously it's
Yeah.
somewhat determined by the nature of the presentation and whatnot, but there might be some common strategies for how to give a better presentation.
Right. And so I think so the first thing just to note is now our attention is directed to skill, technique, and method and improving those versus is this going to get reviewed very well? Am I going to get, so I sometimes say not eyes on the prize, eyes on the process. And the Buddhist tradition is about becoming skillful. What are the skills I can develop to be an effective presenter? And so the attention now is on toolbox skills, these things I can do, not what I am or how I'm going to be perceived. Right. So if you're asking me specifically, what are some skills and techniques, I can answer that. But is that what you're asking, or like for specifically for public speaking? Or
well, I mean, we always try to avoid here are the top quick tips for giving a great presentation. But yet, if I'm someone who is now at a point where like, wow, okay, I am more concerned about the people that I'm presenting to and how best to help them. The next obvious question is like, well, what does that mean? Like, well, what do I do? I like, how should I now be looking at my presentation, or my, the paper I'm going to give, versus what I would have done previously when I wasn't self-aware. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because I can give you my example if that would be helpful.
Great, go for it.
Okay. Like, I think one of the concerns, well, I have two things. One is, I think when you start to think more about the people you're presenting to, you have to like really think deeply about them and how they are coming to the presentation.
Sure.
And the talk, and what might be preoccupying or occupying what's grabbing where's their attention when it's not necessarily on, they want to hear what you have to say, but they're kind of like already thinking, okay, I got this meeting, it's 20 minutes, and then I got something after that. So they're not, you poured yourself into this, the deck or the paper, and you're like, and then you see people out there who, you can tell they're half there with you, or they might be looking at their phones, and that's demotivating. But trying to understand how people, where they're at. And this is why, was it LD Fink? Is that right? Is that who's the
guy? D
LD
Fink. Yeah, is it L? Could be D Fink. D Fink.
It's LD Fink. D Fink.
That sounds right.
But I
just
know,
to be clear, DEE, the name DEE Fink. Just for our listeners, DEE, not the letter D.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I actually used a lot of his work,
great.
With a lot of our clients, because I said, because his whole point is to try to understand the context of the learners. That's like step one. So I thought that was a great exercise for folks, because like, okay, again, you're thinking they're blank slates, that they're just as excited about as you, but they're not. So, and what might be their context, and how, given that, how do you change or your presentation? What do you emphasize more or less compared to what you would have done previously? I think that's a really good first step.
That's the first principle of rhetoric. Know your audience.
Yeah.
Understand your audience. Yeah.
Right. So that's one example. I have another one, but I'll wait for you to, if you have, I can give you my next one.
Go for it.
Okay. And this is a technique that I use a lot, is that somehow I've got to break through their worldviews and get them so they are intrigued, or they give their attention to what I'm talking about. And I think a really good technique for doing that is asking questions and creating this little moment of prevarication, this little moment of doubt. And so, and I think you've seen this when I don't think I'm nearly as good of a presenter as you are. I'm always fascinated when I watch you present, because I think you're just very articulate, and I'm just like, wow, really great stuff. I have a different approach. You see me present. I tend to ask a lot of questions, and I'm always steering it, but I find those
Yeah,
questions a great
I
way.
think you're super skilled at that.
Oh, thank you. But it's a great way to get people invested in your talk. So the example, and I don't know if we've given this one example, is Nick and I were hired to give a presentation to a high school lacrosse camp. And we had to give a talk on drugs and alcohol, which we've done before because, we both of us, well, I worked in campus life. And so at Prince University, and it was an early Sunday morning. These 4 high school students had been training all day on Saturday, and I might have had an early morning workout that morning, but it was like a monsoon. You remember, it was just pouring rain. These kids come in. The very last thing they wanted was a talk on drugs and alcohol. You could,
It was like Sunday morning, right? It was a Sunday morning.
Body language, everything said, we don't want to be here. Make this short because we want to go take a nap or get some food or do something.
Play lacrosse.
Yeah, play lacrosse. Anything but listen to this talk. So Nick and I started the conversation. We said, literally, we're like, okay, why won't you listen to us? Like, that was our first question. Like, why won't you take this talk seriously? And I tell you, like, bang, it was so unexpected. And they were just like, what? We didn't meet their expectations in a really great way. And so they were invested in our conversation. I mean, there's a lot of other things that were going on there. They felt respected, they felt heard, listened to, right. And because we were literally listening to them, and we kind of molded our talk based on what they said to us. But that, just asking that question was a great way to kind of break through what they were anticipating. And
right.
It wasn't, a shock. It was kind of a shock.
Well, it's a dissonance. It interrupts the frame. Yeah. Hey, this isn't, I know these talks, I sit here, they talk, I pretend to pay attention. I'm obedient. I'm docile. So because my coach is watching, but nothing gets in, I don't necessarily engage. Yeah. I think these are powerful social expectations. But
yeah, sorry. Those are the two I would give to people, because they kind of, for me, they are really great ways to kind of indwell and understand where people are coming, how they're coming to it, but then also how to kind of grab their attention in a constructive way by this little doubt and whatever. But anyway, but you have other tips.
Well, one came to mind is, I actually used this last week, which is a version of the question of, what don't people understand about you and your situation? So what do people, the first time I used this was maybe I mentioned this last time or a previous one, doing a presentation for students on academic probation. And I was supposed to do this script and it never worked. And I just hit the moment. I was like, so what do, I said, what do people not understand about being a Division I athlete at a place like Berkeley? Oh man, they all lots to say. And there's one person who went on to be a star in the NFL. I will not say his name. I was like, I knew this guy. I'd seen him around. Talk about taciturn, never engaging. Oh, he was quite willing. And he had a unique experience. He was a superstar, so he had a lot to say. People don't get it. You people don't get it, what it's like to be. So I think that's a version of that. It's changing the relationship. It's saying you're the authority. It breaks the frame. You actually, as a speaker, you actually learn some things you can work with. So you take a few notes and harken back to that, so people feel engaged. And that's actually a version of the first principle, which is know your audience. Well, you can guess about your audience, but you could ask them.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. I think some others, for me, it's about, going back to the Dalai Lama, like, can I put my attention on them and not me? So the metaphor I use is a kind of, if I have a kind of a lens on myself that's outside of myself, I'm looking at me speaking, that's self-consciousness, right? I've created this entity that's observing me and often judging me, and it's outside of me. Well, I'm not going to be as effective, number one, because part of my attention is not on the audience and what I'm trying to do. Part of my attention, and therefore my mental energy, and I'm monitoring and I'm processing. How do I sound? How do I look? Am I smart? Do I look good? Okay. Well, if I'm thinking that, then I'm not thinking making clear the graph on the screen, or choosing my words carefully so that this common misconception isn't conveyed and people, right? So I'm just have divided attention. There's the talk, and then me observing myself giving the talk. Divided attention. Second is, when I observe myself, what am I paying attention to? I'm often paying attention to what I'm doing wrong. So I remember a grad student I work with said, I can't, I did a presentation. He said, wow, that was amazing. You didn't say once. Because like, okay, what? So we're often taught, don't say So if you ask students to evaluate another student, that's one of the things they'll look for. So then what do speakers pay attention to? Did I say Did I say? And I was like, okay, Sean, you know what? No one cares if I said No one, except when you're being evaluated for public speaking. That's the only time people care.
Right.
Now, if you do it over and over and over and over again, that's another matter. But the fact is, if you're effective and you communicate and you're engaging with people, they won't notice or care that you say So actually not caring about saying by focusing on the other people or these other tics and things, they just tend to go away.
Right.
And so one thing I learned teaching people public speaking was giving them a checklist of that was actually highly ineffective. And it got people thinking self-consciously about all these little things that didn't matter and took attention away. So I made a different kind of checklist. Are you having fun? What do you notice about the people's faces? So I think there wasn't quite that, but the point is, where's our attention? Have I created this entity that's observing me and I'm paying attention to the minutia?
Right.
Or am I attending to getting the idea across and how it's being received? And if I'm doing the latter, then I'm not doing the former. And if I'm effective in the in communicating, no one really cares about the other thing. Because remember, 95% of people can't remember anything they learned from the other presentation. So I think we just sometimes putting the attention on that. So I think this is another example, like the checklist is problematic. But then but when you make a checklist, what can you pay attention to? It's often superficial, surface things. Okay, do you want to be paying attention to that? How helpful is that? Well, if you have some tics, or there's a couple things, so maybe holding time in view one or two of those things. I tend to talk fast. Okay, I want to consciously slow down. I've definitely had that little post-it note on my notes, slow down. Or better yet, breathe. If I'm breathing, I can't talk, so I'm slowing down. Right. And then the breath helps me. Or anyway, so I think those are a few things. Mine tend to be get outside my own head, have some fun, learn, explore. And then that just gets me less self-conscious. And my problems originate in being self-conscious and not being present. So it's hard for me. So I don't feel very comfortable up there. You said I'm a good presenter, but I actually don't. That's not usually my experience of it. But the more I'm not judging, the better I am. Yeah. Now, then so I guess the last thing I'd say, what does one need to do to get to a point where they're not self-conscious? So for a lot of people, that means practice.
Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah. Practice. What else? I mean, yeah, I think it's everything we've talked about. I mean, it's not like you're going to become a great public speaker in one day.
No.
So, and I think there's there's techniques and strategies we've talked about, but there's also this deeper, work on yourself that can make you a better person or better presenter. And hopefully, and I was writing this down, I said, and hopefully over time, I think two things that come, your comfort level, with yourself and being upfront, because hopefully there's less at stake, but there can be this excitement and joy almost like, are you having fun? Like, hey, this is pretty cool stuff. Let's explore this together. I happen to be a little farther down the road than you are, and I've done more research. I'm not saying that I'm a know-it-all and I'm all knowing, but I can kind of guide this discussion better. but then that takes some confidence. So I think that's two things. Like, the confidence probably comes first, because and you're confident when less. It's not a life and death situation.
Yeah.
There's less at stake besides, just trying to communicate something that you're excited to share.
Yeah, I guess I could say a few more things. As someone who gets anxious and nervous, and I had an occasion to do that, and at the pitch, I was pretty nervous. So I think what I would have done typically would be thinking about the talk and trying to rehearse it, and I was going to be, and what I've learned to do is to put my attention. Just the goal before I'm talking is to be calm.
Right.
That's the goal. Now it may seem obvious, but I didn't do that. I'd be like rehearsing and I'm not ready on that. And was that slide going to work? And okay, at that point, it's too late. Right. And it doesn't help me. And definitely what does help me if I'm anxious and nervous is to not be anxious and nervous. So then where is my attention? So in this scenario, I was sitting out, you were on the other side of the room and I was over here. I was making a point not to look at the presenters. They were good. And I'm like, oh, they're better than I thought they were going to be. But mainly I was just like, okay, just turn physically for this. At this moment, I want to have no thoughts so that I don't have any anxiety.
Right.
And so I have some techniques for that. They're kind of mindfulness, breathing. I can do like a body scan. Can I feel my feet touching the insoles of my shoes? So I have some skills and tools for that. I think, so that's a very practical thing to me. It took me a long time to figure that out and to learn that, like, okay, I've given talks in front of other people and I got to eat lunch first. Not pleasant. So I'm eating the rubber chicken and the wild rice, whatever that is. And I have to wait till I go up and I don't want to eat, but I also got to talk to somebody because I'm the keynote and then, so I was like, oh, that's a burden I have to go through to get to the talk, to get it over with, rather than actually, this is a nice distraction and I can be fully present and learn from somebody. And hey, if I learn something over lunch, I might start my little talk with a little quip. Hey, Bob said this at the table. It relates to the theme I'm going to talk about, or whatever, right? There's all kinds of things. But I have to be calm and present to be able to do that. So I think for me, it's about the main technique to turn down my emotions, which arise from my self-consciousness, is to be present and put my attention on physically on my body in the moment.
That's a psychological. I know, like, it's interesting because I know when I was doing improv comedy, I was in that troupe. The first thing you do is ground yourself physically.
Right.
Take the physical. That's interesting point. Because once you have the kind of physically know who you are, that everything kind of flows from that. So that's interesting. Like, and I think the grounding is what they would call it. But yeah, good point. Well, can I ask you a question? I know we probably need to wrap up, but I'm curious. So in what Nic was talking about, we were in a pitch competition a couple of weeks ago at Princeton University, and Nic gave we had our little pitch deck, and Nic gave the presentation, and then afterward they had a Q&A. Did you find yourself more comfortable in the Q&A?
Totally.
And what it like, because I know that one gentleman asked about meditation or self-awareness, and you said, well, what do you mean by self-awareness? And what I was like, oh, and I was like,
mindfulness. Yeah.
Mindfulness. And I was like, because I knew you were nervous. I just know you so long. I'm like, oh, Nic's nervous. But you did great. But then once we got into the Q&A, I was like, oh, here's Nic. This is the Nic I know. Like, you are just in your zone, And what's the difference between those two, do you think?
I've thought about it many times.
Yeah.
Somewhere deep inside my head, my body,
Right.
the first one is a performance.
Okay. Right.
And I think there's a lot of levels that, like my upbringing, you do not bring attention to yourself. That is stigmatized. Okay. And I think I am pretty fundamentally self-conscious. So I'll sometimes say, like, I can give a good talk on something I know, but I am not very good at telling a joke. So that performance element, right? And I was surprised. So this is a bit of a history. So I was surprised when I became a teacher that I wasn't very nervous. Because you'd think, well, public speaking, teaching, you're isn't that public speaking? And it just didn't feel the same. And I really spent a lot of time understanding, well, why is that? Well, I'm trying to help people, not perform for them. It's based on, so if I get sucked into this idea that it's a performance, then I've learned to more or less manage that, right? But so I can do it effectively, but I don't enjoy it, and it's not my best, right? Whereas something about that, like it's a conversation and we're talking about ideas, and it just somehow at some basic level, informing and entertaining for me are fundamentally different. And I don't ever want to entertain. I'm not comfortable entertaining people. And I think most people, well, that's not entertaining, but that's kind of how I think of it.
Right.
Or it's, you could just say it's a kind of performance anxiety. It's a pitch contest. It's a contest. You're being evaluated. Now in sports, I love that. That was great. I never really felt that athletically, and not really like a test. I always handled testing. I didn't really have that, but public speaking, in being visible in that way, that evoked it for me. So that's situation scenario. The best I can say is it feels like a performance. There's a deep way that I'm self-conscious. There's a deep family and value, which is you don't bring attention to yourself. So if you're standing up there, you're bringing attention to yourself. Like you're already down the wrong path, dude.
Right.
I don't know. That's the best I can do. And then the other scenario is not that.
Interesting.
So I hope that, I don't know if this is boring to people, but I spend a lot of time thinking about it because I'm like, I got to break that. And still can't have a hard time doing it.
No, I think it's okay to share this. I mean, I hope people are on board with, because it just says, I mean, Nic and I have worked together for many, many years, and I think we've made a lot of progress in both our thinking and thinking together. We've made a lot of progress, but we're still works in progress ourselves.
Absolutely.
And so, I mean, you talk about performance anxiety, and I'm, not experienced in athletics, where I do get that in athletics, and here I am, was a, D1, diver at Stanford University on scholarship at NCAAs, performing at senior nationals, all this stuff. And I always blew it at big meets, like you could count on me, being in there and then doing something stupid on one dive and losing. And even now where I'm, I play this game, platform tennis, and I was sharing with a partner, the guy I play with often, I'm like, man, here I am doing something fun, and I'm experiencing performance anxiety, I get like really tight, and I've made a lot of progress, but I'm like, it's how silly this is that but it's something I've been working on, because I'm like, I don't want to. I mean, right now it shows up where like we have what we're called friendlies. We were just out there playing. Like I was out last night playing, and I play great. I'm having a great time. It's so fun. And then we're in certain leagues, and you have something called PTI, your performance, what's it called, platform tennis index, kind of like your rating, and that's always at stake in these leagues and everything. And I used to be so like worried about my PTI, and I'm like, this year I'm like, I'm not even going to look at my PTI, because it ruins, and I don't play well, and I don't enjoy the leagues as much as I do friendlies, but I want to enjoy the leagues, and I just want to, you want to play well and play smart, but I just want to enjoy myself. And that's been much more the case this year than previous years because of that work, but it's still an issue for me. And a lot of it is my upbringing. There was so much at stake because my parents lived vicariously through me with my athletics. So, performing poorly was
yeah, I mean,
it was not good. So anyway,
not to psychologize that too much or reduce it down, but I think one of the things that I've read a fair bit about test anxiety, performance anxiety, not very many analyses go to that level. Oh, my self-concept and my worth are on the line, and that's why I'm anxious. They tend to focus on the material consequences,
right,
which are real too. It's not that those aren't real. So I think recognizing that it goes to that depth, or can go to that depth, and we're not even aware of it.
No, and I think it's true, because the performance anxiety I have with this platform tennis, which it's so silly to have it, but I have it because of, yeah, because it was a lot of, my need for recognition, to be number one, which was inculcated to, in me
Yeah.
for my part of my upbringing. And so that's still at stake. And so to really, and it's kind of, it's your way of being for so long. And so to let that go, it's hard, and it's very uncomfortable because
Yeah.
you're so used to it. There is a certain level of comfort of getting in there and performing. And then, I would get frustrated with myself. Might beat myself up. Sometimes my partner, if they weren't performing well, you know, um, and yeah, just to really break out of that is super hard, but worth it, worth the effort, obviously.
Well, one thing I would say, so sometimes, and I think a lot of our discussion and certainly my work is, okay, self-worth, attaching a self-worth is, I wouldn't say it's silly or wrong morally. I would say usually I'd say it's unhelpful, and often leads to experiences of anxiety, which takes the fun out of what you're doing, and often also negatively affects your performance.
Yep.
However, self-worth as a motivation is super powerful. We have to acknowledge that many people achieve precisely because their self-concept and their self-worth is attached to that. The question isn't, so it can be effective, especially for generating energy, right? If that's at stake, you're going to have a lot of energy. So, and that energy and effort and persistence are integral often to performance. But so there's other costs, however. Now, so we just have to recognize it's double-edged. And so if it got you to where you got to, and then all of a sudden now it's not working so well, and I think that's what goes on in Princeton, right? I'm a smart person. I'm a STEM person. I'm a great writer. I'm a language person. Then they get to Princeton and they go, whoa, I'm not getting the affirmation of that. I'm not getting the grades and recognition. I'm not that. And then their motivation is where? Because it was so tied up in that. So that, now, were they enjoying what they did in high school? Maybe, I don't know. But the main thing is that it is a powerful motivator. But one thing, I'm just going to give an example too. I kind of coach, not in the sport, but an Olympic athlete, a person who went to the last Olympics. And we were talking about, and there's a certain rankings, and you have to be in the top number to get into the Olympics.
Mm-hmm.
And it's public, and there's certain points, there's an index, and you can know all the time. And they're saying that is not helpful.
Right.
It is a super powerful pull, and it's on your phone. You can get notifications, and you can avoid it, but someone texts you the thing. I mean, it's so hard to get out of that way of thinking. But they're saying, when they're not thinking about that on a daily basis, they feel better. When they're at the meets and they're not thinking about it, they perform better. That was their insight, right? Like, and for me, it makes a lot of sense. Where's your attention? Where is your attention? Is it on the process? Is it on experiencing it, having fun, exploring? Probably your body will respond. Certainly physically, that's what I always found. My body responded to the moment. I didn't have to do too much mentally. In any event, I think, what was my point about that?
Well, can I just say,
Yeah, go ahead.
We were talking, it like, is that it isn't, a lot of that, it can be motivating, but a lot of it's based on fear and
Exactly,
which is a limited resource.
that's right.
And you will exhaust at some point.
Mm-hmm.
You will become exhausted. Where intrinsic motivation, I think those are energizing, and it's
Exactly
that it's limitless. So that's where you can go on forever, really,
right.
Versus, yeah, it's just some point, like even like I think this year for me with this platform tennis, I'm like, I can't be this way. Like I was
Right.
seriously
It's not sustainable.
Yeah, I'm like, do I stop because I don't want to? There's just some point where you go, this can't go on, or I want to change. Not like I've hit rock bottom, but I mean, it's a trivial, in a way, it's trivial, but I do give time to it. So,
Well, I would say if it interrupts your enjoyment,
yeah, exactly.
then that's something to pay attention to. So I think, yeah, one thing I try to get this, sometimes the extrinsic motivation, like in my context, is something like a love of learning and learning knowledge for its own sake. And those are words that get described those describe liberal arts education and research university, and they are enshrined in terms of values and morality. Like, it's good to pursue knowledge for its own sake. This is conveyed to students. What I'm trying to say is the motivation to learn, to explore, for growth, for fascination, is it more helpful for you? Is it more useful? It's not a moral dimension. But it sounds very similar, right? You're saying it's better and it's good, and therefore it's not good if I'm saying no. I'm saying, does it being primarily motivated by extrinsic contribute to your enjoyment? Does it make you want to do it? Does it improve your performance? That's the question. For me, is it help you make more effective, and do you enjoy it more? So therefore, is it sustainable? So to look at, say, motivations, what are the not are they good or bad, wrong or right? It's what are the properties of these motivations and their effects on you, and is that what you want? And then we can name these properties. Not all motivations are the same. Extrinsic versus intrinsic, approach versus avoidance. We can say some things about that. Then we can give people a lens to look at their own motivations and say, what's my profile? What works for me? Not what do I want to work, not what should work. Those are okay questions, but for the purposes of practicality, what are the things that motivate you? So it motivates me. It doesn't motivate, it makes me energized to try to look smart to other people, but it makes me nervous. It doesn't work very well. So it's more helpful for me to say, can I be effective? Then I feel less anxious. So I think when I was in my teacher mode, I was like, can I be effective? Not do I look smart? At least not as much. And then I think that for my motivational profile, trying to be effective somehow, it just works better. I don't feel nervous. I'm not anxious. Maybe I'm more creative. I'm more patient, perhaps. I'm more other directed. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, I think we probably should wrap it up. I think this would be one of our longest. And just so folks know, we had decided on this topic last week, but then we didn't really write down. And so right before we started this conversation, we're kind of like, oh, what were we going to talk about again? And we weren't really sure if this was going to fly. But actually, I think it's really been an illuminating discussion for me.
Yeah, me too.
So this has been great. Anyway, Nic, any last thoughts before we sign off?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I guess just to say that, I think we're doing this work of trying to bring our framework to these questions and and hopefully people see the continuity from if they're listening to one to the next. That's the only thing I would say. We tried hard to do that.
Yeah.
And answer the so what question. I think we did. We really worked hard on the so what.
So what? Yeah. I mean, we were talking about presentations and being in front of people and whatnot. And hopefully we've, shown that even though we tend to go deep and that can seem esoteric, abstract, it does have practical applications. So, and really we think can lead to a better life for all of us. So anyway, with that, Nic, thanks again for a great discussion. Just so folks know, we are recording this on Tuesday, November 25th. So everyone in America who's listening to this, we wish you a happy Thanksgiving. Nic, happy Thanksgiving with your family.
Thanks, Matt. You too.
Till next week.